Okay, all right. Okay. All right, I think I got it. Let's talk about motion compensation. Welcome everyone to Get Your Game On, the channel dedicated to immersive gaming experiences. This is a topic that is so complex. I've done more research on this topic than probably for any other video. I'm by no means an expert, but I've done my best to gather as much pertinent information for you, and I'm going to try to give it to you as concisely and as clearly as possible. And this is one of the most important things that you can look at doing if you have a motion platform and are gaming in virtual reality. So what is motion compensation? Well, motion compensation is a way to counter the movements of the actual motion platform when you're in a virtual reality environment. So let's take a quick look at what motion compensation is and how it works. So as you can see here in this representation, we're going to pretend that this ring that's around the rig is your virtual reality view. And you can see without motion compensation, basically as the rig moves, it moves you around in your virtual reality world. What you're going to run into is it's going to artificially move you around the scene even though you're not physically the one moving. So what we want to do is add some sort of tracker or sensor that we can now tie the virtual reality world to, and that way as the rig moves, the world moves with the rig. So that any motion that the motion platform makes, we're going to cancel out in the virtual reality headset so you don't get that artificial movement and it keeps you in place. Now, what happens if you don't have motion compensation is that you'll see things like on a roller coaster, you'll come out of the harness. Or if you're in a tight cockpit, you'll be sitting in the seat 1 minute and the next thing you know, you're behind the seat or some weird pose that you're not supposed to be in. You might lean outside of the car or outside of the cockpit glass. So it's very disorienting when it happens. So do you think you need motion compensation? Well, a lot of that depends on the experience and the equipment that you're using. So if you have a motion platform that doesn't move a lot, for example, this when I first bought it only moved about 6 degrees in each direction, and I really didn't need motion compensation because it didn't move me enough that I really noticed going outside of the cockpit or being thrown behind the chair or anything like that. But once we added the SFU gearboxes to this, it was a necessity because I was instantly unimmersed by all the movement that I wasn't making inside of the vehicle. So a lot of it also depends on what kind of experience you're using. So if you're racing in, say, a Baja truck, all that movement and jostling that you might get from the motion platform, you probably won't notice because you've got this giant cab of the truck that you're bouncing around in. However, if you're in like a Formula One or an Indy 500 where you're tucked in there and you're real nice and tight, you're likely going to notice a problem. So let's assume that you need motion compensation. What are the next steps? Well, there's a few things you need, and in order to explain those, let's take a step back and talk a little bit more about virtual reality when it started. So when virtual reality first came out, every headset that was manufactured had its own standard that it used to give you the virtual reality experience. And so developers had to basically program for, a Steam headset and an Oculus headset and whatever other things were out there. Well, along came a standard called OpenXR, which strived to take all those VR headsets and different equipment and put them under one standard so that all the devices would work through the OpenXR framework, and basically it allowed programmers and developers to program to one standard versus having to program for all the various ones. Now, today, realistically, there's two standards. You have the OpenXR, and you still have a lot of people that use OpenVR or SteamVR as their preferred platform. So realistically, the only thing you guys need to know is that you just need to know which API or runtime you're using so you can get the appropriate software to interface with the motion compensation. Now, technically, Meta also has their own standard, but if you're using a Meta Quest, I highly recommend you use virtual desktop, which we actually have a link below if you're interested. We'll save you a little bit of money if you need it. You can select either SteamVR or OpenXR, and that's really the best way to use a Quest headset if you're trying to use PC VR with it. What's amazing to me is that this is all community driven. In other words, the VR manufacturers don't actually support this officially. There are 2 individuals that are responsible for making motion compensation possible for all of us out here. And so I want to give a big thank you and a big shout out to both Dschadu and BuzzteeBear. Without these 2 individuals, we wouldn't have motion compensation. And so if you're going to use their software, it's free. But I highly recommend you go to the links that I have down in the description below and please support them. Now, Dschadu did it for SteamVR or OpenVR originally, and he doesn't really update it anymore because everything's kind of moving to OpenXR now. If you're using OpenXR, you're going to use BuzzteeBear's software, which is OpenXR MC or OpenXR motion compensation. And I will have those listed in the links below if you're interested. So with that said, once you know what API you're going to be using, you're going to need some sort of sensor. So one of the most popular sensors is called the Witmotion sensor. It's a very small box, and you take this box and you basically mount it to your rig, and basically it will send data to the software to tell it what motion to cancel out. Conversely, the other option is to get some sort of controller. So this is a old Vive wand. I had one sitting around. I don't use them anymore, so I thought this is the perfect application for that. You could also use a tracker puck, or you could use an index controller. Just anything you want that basically works with the Lighthouse ecosystem. And you can take this and actually physically mount it to your rig, and then this will tell the software what motion to cancel out from the movement on the platform. Now, both options have pluses and minuses. The Witmotion is relatively affordable. It's really easy to install, and it basically works pretty well for pitch and roll. But from our testing, what we've seen is it doesn't work once you get past those 2 degrees. I've confirmed that from our testing, and I'll show you here the results that we found. So what you see here is the actual representation of the physical controller, and then that graphic with the XYZ is the representation of the Witmotion sensor. And as you can see, for pitch and roll, the Witmotion is tracking what the controller is doing. But once we get away from that, you'll see the Witmotion isn't moving anymore. Now you're going to see a little jostling because of the rig actually moving, but you're noticing that it's not tracking like the physical controller. And every movement has a little bit of play on the other axes, and that's why you see that little jiggle there. But in general, the Witmotion, as you can see here, doesn't track like the physical controller does. And if it doesn't track it, there's no way that it can compensate for that motion. So if you're using a 6DOF rig, realistically your only solution is to use some sort of tracking system or a controller system. Now, this gets interesting as well because it depends on the headset you're using. So as you know, there are 2 different types. There's inside-out tracking and outside-in tracking. Now, outside-in tracking is your Lighthouse solution, where you've got your headset and then you mount lighthouses and it basically reads where everything is. And then the inside-out tracking is where the headset looks at the controllers to tell where they're at. Well, you can see a problem here. If you're using a controller for motion compensation, you're going to have it constantly mounted in front of you so that the headset can always see it. Now, this will probably work just fine if you're racing, because most of the time when you're racing, you're mostly looking out the front and you might glance to the side once in a while, but your vision is mostly centered in the front. Where you run into a problem with this is if you're into flight, especially if you're dogfighting, because in dogfighting, you're looking all around trying to find a bandit, and you're not always looking straight ahead so it knows where the controller is. And if you lose tracking on the controller, your world goes flying off into nowhere, and it's very, very disorienting. So the way to solve this is to make sure whatever VR headset you're using uses the outside-in tracking if you're going to be doing a lot of dogfighting, or if you're going to be looking around behind you, in front of you, and all those sorts of things. So that leads to a problem that I've really been working hard to fix or find out a solution for all of you. As you know, the Quest headsets are very popular. And so the Quest 3, which I currently think is the best value out there for VR headsets, well, it's inside-out tracking. So what do you do if you have a Quest 3 headset and you are someone who likes to do aerial dogfighting? Well, I found a solution for you. And the solution is this lovely controller right here. This is a Quest Pro controller. I specifically bought these to test out if they would work in place of one of the Lighthouse tracked setups, and they do. So that means if you get a Quest Pro controller, you can have the same experience as someone that's doing a Lighthouse tracked controller, and it's perfect if you have more than 2 or 3 degrees of freedom on your motion platform. Now, I will tell you, these are not cheap. They're about $250. And you can see I've actually got one mounted on the rig right there so I could test it. But what this allows you to do is use the Quest controller, because this has its own tracking internally. It's got its own cameras around it, so it doesn't care where the headset is. It doesn't need to be seen by the headset to work. And thankfully, this is an awesome solution for those of you that have a Quest 3. Now, one thing I will warn you, if you are using an IR blaster, so you can use your Quest 3 at night, we found that this does not work with IR lighting, so you're going to have regular illumination for these to work. But I've been really impressed with the quality of the tracking and how well this has worked for all my dogfighting. So now, as I mentioned, this is about $250, but if you compare that to the solution that you have to look at for Lighthouse tracking, you're looking at probably around $500 by the time you get a couple Lighthouse base stations and you get some controllers. So realistically, even though this is a little expensive, it's still far more affordable than the other solution that most of the rest of us have to do. So that's my recommendation. If you have a Quest 3, get you some Quest Pro controllers. They have to be the Pro, and that is the solution. Now, what do you do once you have a controller? Let's talk a little bit about one of the disadvantages to using this style of controller versus the Witmotion. So the Witmotion is really good at insulating itself from any kind of vibration. These feel everything on the rig. So if you have a transducer like a butt kicker or any kind of transducer, these things are going to vibrate based on how hard that butt kicker is reaching them. What that means is you're going to have to build a customized mount to isolate this from vibrations that you're getting from your transducers. So let's talk a little bit about the important parts of a mount if you're going to do that. So the first thing is this needs to be solid. You need to have a mount that's solid enough that this isn't wiggling around or flopping around, because if that happens, your view is going to be all over the place. I highly recommend mounting this behind your head, because that's going to be the most representative of the motion that you're feeling when you're moving around. And so I highly recommend that. And plus, you want to have this up high enough that the lighthouse can see it. So you want to think about that when you're doing your mount. On this controller, it's important because you have your cameras here. You don't want any of these cameras to see like the chair, so you wouldn't want to mount it like where these cameras are looking at the back of the chair. You need these cameras to be able to see the room so it can actually read where the controller is in the room. So those are the important considerations in doing a mount with one of these. So it needs to be solid, but it also needs to isolate from vibration. Now there's two ways to isolate vibration from anything. You either use like some sort of rubber to absorb the vibration and keep it from even getting to the controller, or you can add weight to a mount, and that weight will also absorb the vibration, because the vibration has to work harder to vibrate something that's heavy versus something that's light. So you want to do some kind of combination of absorbent material and weight to make this as isolated from vibration as possible. Now, Dschadu and his OpenVR or SteamVR application is no longer being developed. The good news is BuzzteeBear, if you're using OpenXR, has continued to develop his software, and his latest version has some really good software filters to help mitigate that vibration. So a combination of a physical mount that isolates the controller from vibration along with the software filtration should give you an experience that is acceptable for your motion compensation. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about how I mounted one of these units to the DOF Reality rig. So the first thing I did was go out to Etsy and actually find a mount that I thought would work well with my controller. We ordered it up, and as soon as it came in, we actually disassembled it, and I installed rubber pieces between all the connection points to help continually mitigate the vibration even within the mount itself. Once we did that, we went ahead and drilled the holes in the chair. And a little tip for you, if you use magnets, you can capture all those little metal shards that are coming from the drilling and keep them from falling in your chair. After we drilled the chair out, we were able to mount some rubber isolators that actually help with vibration, and we put a large metal plate on top of that along with our mount for the controller. And this first generation we tried, you can see we have some additional isolators between the mount and the metal plate. This one didn't work very well because when the rig would move side to side, the controller would flop left and right, and it messed up my view. So we changed the design and added stability for left and right in addition to up and down. And this design worked good to keep the controller really solid during movement. But unfortunately, we still had more vibration than I wanted with this mount. So I researched online and found out that maple apparently is the best wood for absorbing vibration. So we got a block of maple, cut that out, and basically place that on top of the isolators that are mounted to the big metal plate. And you can see I also got a USB cord to keep the controller constantly charged, so I didn't have to worry about that part. This seemed to mitigate quite a bit more vibration, but unfortunately I still had more than I wanted, so we went ahead and added some wheel weights to the overall mount itself. So after all that, we finally got the mount to mitigate the vibrations, and I was very happy with the end result. And I'll have all these pieces that we used in the description below if you're interested in ordering them for your application. Let's talk a little bit about the importance of setting this up properly and how it works in application. So we're going to go through the steps. I'm going to show you basically how this works for both the SteamVR variant from Dschadu and then also the OpenXR variant from BuzzteeBear. So let's look at that now. So let's start by talking about the OpenVR motion compensation, or the motion compensation you would use for SteamVR. So you're going to open the download link in the description and download the software. And once you get that done, basically we're going to go to the download and we're going to install it. So you just basically start it up, same process. And you can see I've already got this installed. And because I've already got this installed, you can see I've got it saying that's already installed, but let's go ahead and do it anyways. And we're going to go down and we're going to agree and we'll let it do its thing. So once you have the program installed, here are the next steps. So first off, every time you start this, you need to go to Setup in Sim Racing Studios and click Motion Compensation. And each time you do this, you need to click these little recenter icons for the Witmotion sensor. So you need to do that. And if you want instructions on SteamVR or OpenXR, you can find detailed instructions on motion compensation there. So that's all we have to do in Sim Racing Studios. And then obviously our runtime is selectable here. We're going to be in SteamVR because that's what we're talking about. And then the other thing you want to really make sure of is in SteamVR, you want to come down to Settings and you want to check just to make sure that your VR motion compensation is turned on. If for some reason you're not seeing it, this is probably the reason why. And once you do that, everything's set up, you're good to go. And then you're ready to go into the actual setup of the software or API itself. So the next step is to jump into VR, and we'll show you those steps next. So we're going to go down here now, and we're going to click on OpenVR motion compensation. If you don't see this, you may have to add it with this plus sign. But I've got it right here, so we're going to open it here. And this is basically all the settings for OpenVR motion compensation. Now, these two values right here are what you're going to use to filter out any vibrations that you might have. So you can adjust those as you see fit. These are the settings that work for me, and you can see the range at which you can set them. Now, This virtual driver is important if you're using the Witmotion, and this allows you to set up the Witmotion to be at the proper center of rotation on your rig. And what you want it to do is basically you want the blue line to come out in front of you. You want to look to the left and right and see the red line coming out the sides. And then if you look up, you're going to see we have the y-axis basically coming out of the top of our heads. And so this is the correct situation. And if it doesn't look like this, you basically use these settings to get it into the proper orientation. Once you have everything set, you're going to go back and you're going to apply, which is there. And we should be set for having all those settings saved. Now, this is where you set up. Obviously, we only have one HMD right now, so that's set. And then if you look here, you're going to see this is where you select the tracker or controller. So because we're using the Witmotion, we're going to use Sim Racing Studio Virtual Tracker. We're going to go Witmotion, and then all you have to do is enable motion compensation and hit apply. Motion is compensated. Now, it's a much simpler process if you're just using a controller and not using the Witmotion. Basically, once you install the software, all you have to do is make sure that your OpenMotion VR compensation is active, and you come here, and again, what you want to do is go to settings. You're going to set these. You don't have to worry about any of this offset because you're not using a virtual driver anymore. Just get your filtration right so you don't have any vibrations from your butt kicker. And then you simply select the proper controller instead of the SRS, which you won't even see because we're not using it. And again, enable motion compensation and apply. And you should see motion compensated here, and you are all set and ready to go. Okay, so let's move on now to OpenXR motion compensation. And you're going to start by following the link again. And the link will take you to this page, so if there's a future update, you'll know where to get it. Basically, come down to the latest build, click here, and you'll see currently it's 0380. And what we're going to do is scroll all the way down here, and you will see it says install OpenXR motion compensation. So go ahead and click that and let it download. So after you've downloaded it from the link, you're going to double click here, and it's going to ask you if you want to install it. You say yes, go through your agreement, and go next. And this is going to give you all the information from the latest updates and everything. Okay, so here it says select additional tasks, and I'm going to go ahead and do that because I do run older programs, and I don't see as that would be an issue. All right, so here we go. We're going to install it. And then you get the option for the user's guide. Now, I highly recommend you read this. This will give you all the details, but we're going to go through the basics right now to give you a setup. But if you decide to use this program, definitely take a look at the user's guide. And we're going to finish. Okay. So once you've installed OpenXR motion compensation, we're going to go configure the file. And the way OpenXR motion comp works is it's actually an ini file that you edit through text. So let's go find it now. So where it is it's under your local drive, users, under whatever your name is, and you're going to go up here to app data, and we're going to go to local. And once we're in local, we're going to scroll down until we find OpenXR motion compensation. So the very first thing I want you to do when you come in here is take this OpenXR motion compensation ini, and I want you to copy it. We're going to paste it in here. And so what I'm going to do is we're just going to rename this. We're going to name this original. And this way, you've got an original copy of the file, so you'll never have to worry about corrupting this or getting so out of whack that you can't go back. Never edit this one. Just keep that as an original copy that you can revert back to, and you can make another copy and rewrite it. So once you do that, then let's go ahead and edit this. And you can see right here, we've got all this stuff that we can adjust. So again, the user manual actually covers all of this in detail, but we're going to go over some of the highlights real quick just so you have a basic understanding. But I encourage you to actually read all the documentation so you know what all of these settings do. So most important is to have it working. So there you go, you have it enabled, and you basically want to look at, this is where if you're using a Witmotion sensor, this is going to be set to 0 because you're not using a physical controller. If you're using the controller method, that needs to be 1. Okay? And then the other very important thing, this is an interesting one. This set 1 to initialize physical tracker. Again, this only applies if you're using a physical controller and not the Witmotion. But what this really does is it basically tells this to start right away, and it's going to be really dependent on the program you're using. There isn't a universal setting for this. This is really a troubleshooting setting that if you're trying to launch a game and you're having trouble, come in here and change this to a 1 and see if that works better. Or if you already have it set to a 1 and it's not working, change it to a 0. So it's really an on-off switch that you're going to have to apply based on whatever the program is you're using. And that's just because programs are all programmed differently. So you can have this obviously start on startup, and when it starts, it's going to give you a countdown. You can adjust your countdown there, and you can tell it not to do the countdown and all that good stuff. So let's get down to this tracker section now. This is very important. So if you're going to use the Witmotion, and in my case, I'm using it through the SRS software, I would change this to SRS. But because I'm using a controller, it needs to say controller. Now, if you're using a controller, you have to designate if you're using the left controller or right controller. And then there's also other options down here, but likely you're going to either use a left or right controller depending on which one you have mounted to your motion platform. So then we get down into this offset. So these settings right here are going to be used if you have a Witmotion installed. If you have a controller installed, you don't need to worry about this, but this allows you to correctly position the virtual tracker that the Witmotion is going to give you in the proper space. But BuzzteeBear, in the latest revision of his software, came up with a much better solution for this if you have a Quest 3 headset, and we're going to cover that now. So what I'm about to show you is one of the latest advancements that BuzzteeBear has made with his OpenXR motion compensation program, and this is one of the coolest advancements if you have a Quest 3. So as always, whenever you're using the Witmotion, the first time you start it up, you've got to come into SRS, and you've got to make sure that motion compensation is on, and then you've got to come down here, and you've got to hit these little bullseyes to make sure that everything's zeroed out. And then once you do that, we're going to go in for the very first time. You have to go into virtual desktop. Again, if you're going to do PCVR in a Meta Quest, please use virtual desktop. It is the best solution. And again, we have a link that'll save you 15% down in the description below. So you're going to come here and go to streaming, and you have to do this one time. You're basically going to do VR pass-through, and we're going to turn that on environment. Now you want to configure this, and you want to make the color that is the pass-through color magenta, and that's just full red and full blue, and that'll give you the magenta. And once you do that, you don't ever have to mess with this again. So once we do that, we're going to go into our flight sim program. We're going to start up Microsoft Flight Simulator. Okay, so now that we're in VR in Microsoft Flight Simulator, we're going to go ahead and we're going to set our center of rotation, and we're going to do that by using the default controls of Control and D.
Overlay activated.
Which will give us an overlay, and then we're going to hit Control Shift D.
Pass-through mode activated.
And check this out. Instead of having put all those numbers in and do all the measurements, now we can set the center of rotation through our pass-through in the Quest 3 and simply just grab it and move it wherever we want it, and it should basically be sitting pretty much right under your butt like that. Now once you've got that part done, all you need to do is save the configuration, and you're going to do that by hitting default keys of Control, Shift, and S.
Configuration saved.
And there you go. So now that you've got your center of rotation set up, let's continue to configure the rest of the OpenXR file. So we're going to go ahead and scroll down. We don't have to worry about any of this stuff. And we're going to come down to this filter section. And this is the section where you're going to try to mitigate any vibrations through this software. And what you want to do is basically adjust these settings until you're not getting the vibration from your butt kicker in your view. Now, this is going to be dependent on your setup, how good a mount you made, and all those kinds of things. For me, the default settings worked fine, but you may have to adjust them. Now, what you're looking for is you want to adjust them strong enough that you don't have any vibrations appearing in your screen. But if you go too far, you're going to get some lag, and it's going to feel like you're swimming, and you're not going to get, the motion is going to be tied to you as sharply if you go too far on these settings. So again, find a balance that works for you, and that's will help you right here mitigate that butt kicker vibration. So the rest of this stuff, basically the big important things are your shortcuts, and this is going to tell you what the keys are for activating the different aspects of the software. So the most important one is probably this activate, reactivate one. I've got mine set to Control plus Alt because those are easy keys for me to find when I'm in VR, and so you can change these to anything you want. So that's all the important stuff. Again, there's full documentation on what all of these settings do, and I encourage you to read it, but that is the big points that I wanted to hit in this video for configuring OpenXR motion compensation. So let's talk about how we get OpenXR motion compensation to work. So because we've configured everything in the configuration ini, it's a very simple process. If you're using a controller, all you have to do is start your game, and it should fire right up as long as you have it set to auto start. If you're using a Witmotion sensor, then you have one additional step. Before you get into VR, you'll want to come down to Sim Racing Studio and go to your setup, just like before. Go into motion compensation, and again, you want to make sure you hit these bullseyes and center the Witmotion so you don't have any calibration issues. And once you do that, just go in and start your game up. You should hear it tell you
Motion compensation activated.
And that's all there is to it. So the nice thing is you can set up the OpenXR to automatically start with your program. So realistically, you don't have to mess with anything. Now for me in SteamVR, I have to actually activate my motion compensation every time I start SteamVR. But it's pretty simple. I just go to this interface and basically click on the motion activation, and it shows me that it's compensated, and I'm good to go until I play the next time. So I even tried Pimax's motion compensation software, and it did not work well at all. The biggest problem I saw was there's not enough adjustability within it. So you're going to have to mount that controller in a specific orientation on the rig, and it didn't have any sort of filtration for vibrations or anything like that. So I was not a fan of the Pimax motion compensation at all. Again, you want to stick with either BuzzteeBear or Dschatu's software. Those are definitely the premier interfaces or applications that I recommend. So I hope this at least helps you understand motion compensation, why it's important, and if you may need it or not. And if you do, how you can get it working on your system. So that'll do it for today. And I just want to thank you guys from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much for watching our channel and all the support you give us. I do this because I really want you folks out there to have the experiences that I get to enjoy on my DOF Reality H6 and in virtual reality. And I just want to share all this with everybody so that hopefully someday down the road, you might get to experience it as well. So thank you guys. And until next time, remember to get your game on.